Hi, and welcome to Creating a Life You Love with Adriana, where we talk about all things mental, spiritual, emotional health, and how to create a healthy lifestyle centered on the Lord. And an important factor in having a healthy lifestyle is this idea of going back in order to move forward. And so imagine you know someone, let's call her Sarah, okay? Sorry to all the Sarahs for what I'm about to illustrate here, but this may relate to you. So say this person, this girl named Sarah, had her life together. So it appeared, right? She went to church, she served, she volunteered, and she just seemed to juggle everything in her life miraculously, if you're looking from the outside in. But Sarah, right, grew up in this family where success wasn't just encouraged, it was expected. So in her mind growing up, her idea of work and achievement related to the amount of love she received. But if she failed even a little bit, she felt unworthy. She felt disappointed in, and just felt horrible. And so now, as an adult, she became a Christian, and instead of working through these things in her past, she's still driven by this same belief that to be loved is to succeed in a very worldly sense of how much money can she make, how good can she look, how many praises can she get from other people. And so she filled her life with church activities, reading the Bible, all these things to make her believe that she was um, going to be worthy if she did all of these things, but she was still left feeling inadequate, never satisfied, and never feeling like what she was doing was enough. And imagine, one day she's going through a very difficult time and she's just struggling. Like everything just seems to be piling on her that day. And she just breaks down and she realizes that maybe this weight that she has been carrying has been with her ever since she was a child. And even though she became a Christian and was a new person, became a new person in Christ, there are still old habits and old beliefs that have not died with that she has not given over. And so, in this moment of just kind of giving up, she's realizing that her family's expectations are still with her to this day now that she's an adult. And this is similar to kind of how my life played out. I had this idea that any negative emotion, negative feeling I had, I could just shove under the rug and just move forward because all that mattered was that I'm moving forward. But eventually, what happens is if you shove enough things under the rug, you're going to trip over it and have a mental breakdown, an emotional breakdown, and feel like your life is falling apart. And that's what I don't want to happen to you. So, my goal, and kind of just talking about this today, is just to illuminate the idea that if you do not go back and look at your past, look at your family's past, and work through these things that could be affecting you, you're going to bring that in the next generation. You are going to be affected by the weight of whatever your family kind of put on you, maybe something that maybe they grew up with or whatever it is. You have the power through the Holy Spirit to break any generational things, but only if you are aware of it. If we keep shoving things under the rug, we're just going to kind of go on with life thinking that all that matters is we're moving forward. And I was under the impression a while ago that I think there's this quote that goes, "You can't move forward or drive forward by looking in the rear view mirror." And that is so true. You can't continuously look at the past. But at the same time, if you don't look at the past and if you don't look at these things that could have affected who you are now, you are going to make the same mistakes. You are going to continuously repeat things that might have happened in generations, whether that's marriage issues or alcoholism or addictions or anger, defensiveness, whatever it is, you are going to repeat that if you don't. Bring that up and realize that this is an issue. So, we're going to go through that today. And maybe you're thinking, like, okay, like I know your past affects your future. I know all of this. And that's something that even before becoming a Christian, like I did have this idea of like, yeah, your past affects your future. Like, okay. And so I went to therapy and they kind of like would talk through things through my past and all of this. But the issue was every time I would leave one of these therapy sessions, I just kind of left feeling very drained. And so I realized later on the reason why I felt so drained is because I was bringing all of these horrible things that might have happened in my past up that I didn't want to think about. And then there was no relief after. There was no like, I'm bringing this to the Lord, I'm working through this. It was just like, oh, an hour is up in this therapy session. Now I go home and have no one to talk to, and I'm feeling frustrated that I can't work through these things till next week when I meet with my therapist. And not bashing therapy at all here, but I'm just saying that the way that I was doing it was not involving God, not asking God for help through these things. And so this idea that we can just push through, push forward, and do these things on our own is just so false. And so no matter what family you've grown up in, where your environment has been, everyone is carrying some type of baggage. And I wanted to like place emphasis on even if you think your childhood was great, your family always loved on you, always showed that they cared, and you went to church every week, you a good Christian family, there are probably still things that you have adopted from your family that is not fitting what Christ likeness looks like. So I'll go more into that later, but no matter, some people are going to carry more emotional baggage, some people are going to carry less, but regardless, there's still improvement to be made and still things that you can acknowledge from your childhood and bring that to the Lord. I also wanted to touch on the reason why I wanted to talk about this. Last week, I went to this retreat type thing where it was from 9 to 5 on a Wednesday. And in this time, you were with these prayer ministers, and you would meet with them kind of like a counseling setting, but there would be three of them in a room, and they would ask you questions, walk you through things, and pray with you. And so it was very, this emotional thing where they're asking you questions about, maybe struggling with feelings of unworthiness and inadequacy, and they're asking you questions about, okay, did your anyone in your family ever struggle with this? Do your grandparents, do you know anything about that? And so they're asking questions ultimately to understand why the root of this issue is. And so something that came up for me, just one of the things, there were many things that came up for me in this day, but one thing was that I constantly apologize. Like it's almost an obsession to say, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, because ever since I was a child, I'd always feel bad for my presence. I would be clumsy and maybe break things. And so I carried this with me through life of like being afraid to take up space and always feeling bad for my presence. And then looking more in depth, you can also see, oh, maybe. Someone in my family deals with this, and that was a thing for me. I was able to look at that and be like, huh, yeah, that could be a factor. So anyway, I did that, whole retreat last week. And then I'm trying to figure out what to talk about on this podcast. And so I'm sitting down and I'm like, you know what? I think I want to talk about maybe like the need to acknowledge how your past affects the present and how to do that. And so I'm kind of thinking about it. I'm like, okay, maybe. And then I pull out this book. It's called Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, which I talked about this last week. And I was going to read this book anyway that day. But I open it up, and the chapter that I'm actually on or about to start is going back in order to go forward. And I was like, okay, I gotta touch on this. I gotta talk about this, because like I said, um, about this whole idea with Sarah, who we talked about, this person who kind of like filled religious practices in her day to try to make her feel better about herself and make her feel like she was achieving. I kind of had that similar idea of like, God will only love me if I do this, 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 and this. You want to get rid of that because that's going to affect your relationship with Christ. That's going to affect your friendships. That's going to affect everything. And this misconception that I think we have as Christians is that once we accept Jesus into our hearts, once we say we believe in him, we have a relationship with Christ, all of the things that once weighed us down are going to be completely gone. And there's miraculous stories, and that's great. That's major healing in just a snap of a finger, right? However, there are still things that we need to work through and that may be in that person's mind who overcame that addiction by the Lord taking that desire out of their hearts, that they need to actively focus on. And this misconception that we have in Christianity is that once we're saved, everything's good, everything is good. And we can get rid maybe we have this idea that we can get rid of negative feelings by reading the Bible and by praying. And yes, all of those are good things. We want to have these spiritual disciplines of reading the Bible, praying, being in community. But if we aren't getting to the root cause and we're just opening up the Bible to numb our emotions and numb our pain of unworthiness, that's an issue, right? And so this book talks a lot about um, looking at the unwritten scripts or the unsaid scripts that you may have had in your life and when you were younger. And this is something that I would encourage you to ask the Lord about, but we'll get into that later, of seeing if there's any unsaid scripts in or said scripts in your childhood that your parents, or whoever raised you kind of put on you, or even society or culture or your friends. What I mean by this is maybe you had this idea of, to be loved is to look good. And so you are constantly striving to look better, whether that's putting your time into excessively working out, getting work done on your body constantly, spending hours making sure you look good and making sure your outfits look amazing. Um, Maybe you have that, and that's from your childhood. So I'd encourage you to like look at anything in your life that you have some negative emotions towards. Maybe that's the way you look. Where did that come from? And then asking the Lord in prayer, where did this come from? Something that this book talked about was this idea that community is going to help you understand why you do the things you do. Before I got into this relationship with my boyfriend, honestly, I thought I was like pretty good. Like I thought that my life, the way I thought, the way I did things, like I knew I had some things to work on, but I thought that I didn't have so much to work on, right? And I get into this relationship and I realize that I can be defensive. My conflict resolution is not great at times, and this all comes from when I was younger. I was very stubborn. I always wanted to get my way, and so I would constantly butt heads with my mom. And this way of conflict resolution, followed me all the way up until the relationship I have now. I thought that conflict resolution means fighting it out till you get your way. Now I'm learning, oh, maybe it means taking a step back and bringing your this conflict to God and then coming back together and working through things, not just fighting it out and hashing it out right then and there. And so this idea of your deepest wounds can come from relationships, but also your deepest healing. And so the role of community is just so, so important. Um, when you are around other people, you're going to hit conflict. You're going to have hard, difficult times. You're going to butt heads with one another. And this may be seen as like, oh, not this is, I just want to isolate. Like, I don't want to be around anyone. But once these things come out from you, come out from the surface, you're then able to see, like, why did I get so defensive? Why did I complain 24/7 about this circumstance? I was just talking the other day with my friend, and talking about how we both like to complain about things. And anytime there's this realization of, oh, I complain a lot. Oh, I'm defensive. Oh, I get angry. Bring that to the Lord and ask him, go to him and say, Lord, where does this come from? Where does this anger come from? Can you bring a memory into my mind of when I first experienced this? And like I said earlier, something that I struggled with was constantly apologizing for my presence. I asked the Lord to reveal to me, why is it that I'm struggling with this? Why do I constantly feel the need to say I'm sorry? And I realized it's because when I was a child, when I was little, I thought that everything was always my fault. I thought that I would break anything. I would maybe spill something, and I thought that, um, when I did that, no one wanted to be around me, and should constantly apologize for being a burden and apologize for my presence. And this is something that I'm actively working on. I've realized this, and the Lord has brought this to my attention. But I still have this compulsion to constantly say I'm sorry. And so it's kind of funny. The other day, I was in the car, and this was just after the whole retreat that I did. And I was in the car with my boyfriend, and I apologized for something, and I'm like, "Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry." And it was nothing that I needed to apologize for. So I caught myself, and I was like, "Actually, I'm not sorry. I don't need to be sorry. I don't need to be sorry, right?" And so it was like this idea of just stopping and saying, "Wait a minute. I usually am conditioned to think, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. But right now, I'm going to take a step back, and I'm going to reevaluate. Do I actually need to say I'm sorry?" And it turns out, no, I don't. There was nothing that needed to be apologized for. I was just apologizing for my presence, which was conditioned in me at a very young age. And so, anytime you have this negative emotion, ask yourself. It doesn't have to be in that moment, but maybe make a note of it and then bring it to the Lord in your quiet time later. Ask Him, why is this a factor? Why is this a thing in my life that keeps coming up? If you see a pattern of complaining, of bitterness, of anger, the Lord says in James 5 that if we ask for wisdom, He will gladly give it to us. If we ask Him to reveal things in our childhood, He will gladly show us. It might not be in the time frame that you want. Maybe it will come in a different way that you expected, but He wants us to work through these things and to bring these things to Him. Now, if you're sitting in, your quiet time, and you're asking the Lord, Lord, I've been struggling with unworthiness. And I don't know where it stemmed from. Like, there's no, like, I just don't see anything in my mind of where it stemmed from, but it feels like all my life I've just had this deep, deep feeling of unworthiness. So I kind of mentioned earlier about generational issues. This book, I would also, if you want to go more in depth on this, I would suggest that you read this book, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. It talks about this and so much more. But this book talked about how we can be impacted by generations, like by our uncles, our aunts, our great grandparents, our grandparents, going all the way back 2 to 3 generations. So, say your great grandma, she struggled with depression, and then she didn't work on that. So, she passed that on to your grandma. And then your grandma passed that on to your mom passed that on to you, and now you, from a young age, have had this deep feeling of depression, you know? There was kind of this ongoing debate about the influence of genetics versus environment. So, if you've ever heard nature versus nurture, this idea of depression coming from your DNA because your great grandma had it, your grandma and your mom had it, or is it this idea of your environment? Since you were a child, you sensed this depression from your mom and maybe these feelings of anxiety or unworthiness. And so you adopted that because you, as a child, were raised in this environment where someone was depressed. And so it could be both, it could be one or the other, but there's kind of this ongoing debate about, is it nature, is it nurture, is it both? But all we know, the Bible doesn't give a direct answer to this, but all we know is that it is just one of the mysterious workings of God's universe. Just one of the things that we may not have all the answers to, but we know that it is a real thing. I mean, we even see in the Bible, I wanted to actually touch on that. In this book, it mentioned that in the Bible, we see the power of family and the power of generational curses. There's generational blessings, yes, but also generational curses. And so I wanted to open to a point in here. It talks about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so if you're familiar with the Bible, if you aren't, perfectly fine. You can look up these people later. But the pattern of lying in each generation. We see this in the Bible where Abraham lied about Sarah. Isaac and Rebekah, was their marriage was characterized by lies. Jacob lied to almost everyone, and his name actually meant deceiver. And then 10 of Jacob's children lied about Joseph's death. And so it's this idea of this generational kind of sin of being deceitful, lying, having malicious intent behind that. And we see that in the Bible in so many different stories. And so we know if we're seeing it in the Bible all these years ago, we're most definitely going to see it in our modern world today. And so I would encourage you to look at, ask the Lord to bring anything to mind that could have been a generational thing. And the Lord is not going to hold anything against you of like, well, your grandparents died and, you're not close with your mom. And so since you don't know if this was a generational thing that they struggled with, you're just out of luck. You're gonna have to struggle with this. You're gonna have to suffer with this too, since you don't know if it's from your generation or what it's from. The Lord is not gonna hold against hold that knowledge that you don't know against you. But it's just this idea of seeing, is something in your family passed on to you. Um, I have a friend who unworthiness, she realized that that was passed on from generation to generation. And so she wants to be the one to break that, right? So she doesn't pass that on to her children, whether through DNA or through the environment that they are around. And so all in all, the number one thing I'd recommend that you don't do is shove things under the rug because they're going to come up later. And I was looking back at my journal, and that is exactly what I would do anytime emotional things or feelings would come up that I didn't like. I wouldn't look to see if that's something that stemmed in my childhood. And I know it's easier in the moment to maybe feel not confident and have these feelings of unworthiness that have lasted for years in your life. And I know it's easier to just keep moving forward and not think about it and try to get it out of your mind, and but it's going to affect every area of your life because these things that have stemmed from whether it's our childhood or generations before us, they are deeply ingrained beliefs that the only way we can get help from it is by the Lord. No one else has access to the inner workings of your brain besides the Lord. Now, the way that I've found I'm able to learn different patterns in my life and things that are unhealthy that I've adopted from my childhood is by having community around you. So, having friends, right? Being in friendships where you can call each other out, having a relationship where my boyfriend can call out when I am being defensive, when I am complaining, and then can bring that to my mind so I can be like, I wonder where that stemmed from in my life. Is that something that I've always carried myself, with? Is this something that is complaining, something that started from a young child? And this is by no means to excuse someone's behavior of like, oh, well, they were just always like this. Like, no, this is to understand why you do the things you do. And it's to look to see where this stemmed from so you can go back and bring that to the Lord and help yourself through that. So please do not put your emotions down the drain, think that they're invalid because you didn't have a horrible childhood experience. Whatever your experience was, there are things that I'm sure you can bring to the Lord. And I'm sure that will be revealed to you if you are getting around other believers, if you're in community, if you're having close relationships where you have no choice but to kind of show your flaws, right? But with that being said, I hope that this week we can. Yes, move forward, just like Hebrews 12 says, where we move forward and we strip every weight off that is not pushing us towards Christ, that we can remove every weight that's holding us back. Um, but when we do that, we also remember not to just brush things off because we don't want to go back and work on them. Remember this week, anytime you have a negative emotion, you have some feelings that come up that you don't like, bring it to the Lord. Pray through that. Ask Him why you have these things that may seem like a pattern in your life, whether that is people pleasing, overperforming, poor conflict resolution, emotional suppression. What is it that seems to be a pattern in your life that you can bring to the Lord, and He can help you realize where this stemmed from and how to work through it? But with that being said, I hope you have a wonderful week. And if you did like today's podcast episode, make sure to like it, subscribe, and follow if you want to hear more. And remember that the only way we can create a life that we love is if we go back to go forward.